Hey, this is Eddie from Wunderlich, and in this short video I'd like to show you how easy it is to install our S1000 XR Engine Protection bars. So easy that you can do it yourself in your own garage. So let's get started. Alright, first we're going to start off on the left side. There's going to be two fasteners that we're going to remove. It's going to be this fastener up here that mounts to the frame, and then there's also another one on the front of the engine that also has a bracket that holds on to this bottom spoiler. So the very top mount requires a T50. Good to use an extension. We're going to pop this bolt out. There's going to be a radiator hose, so you kind of want to push this back so you don't cause any damage. So first we'll crack it loose, and then we'll back this bolt out, pushing the radiator hose off to the side. So this bolt comes out. This is going to get replaced. Next bolt is kind of up here tucked under. What I'm going to use is I'm going to use a 3/8 with a extension and then a wobble drive so I can get up in the tucked area. You can also use a Torx T-handle, but either way, whatever you decide to use, you just want to make sure you don't strip the bolt and it comes out easier. All you really need to do is just crack the bolt loose. So for this, you're going to need a T45. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in between the radiator and the oil cooler, in between the headers, just to get a solid fix on the bolt. So once you get fixed, all you really need to do is just break it loose. You can take the wrench out and just loosen it up by hand. Comes out pretty easily. So you'll see this hangs down, but it's going to get reattached. So this bolt is no longer needed because it will be replaced. All right, with those two fasteners removed from the bike, next thing we're going to do is install these two silent blocks. It's very important when installing them that you use Loctite. We use a medium grade Loctite thread locking fluid made by Liquid Moly. It comes in a bottle. Great thing to have in any toolbox. A little tip on installing these silent blocks to your bike is there's not a really good way to grip it, but what I do is once you put thread locking fluid on the threads, you then run the fastener on the back, tighten the fastener all the way in, and then you'll be able to use an 8mm socket to tighten the silent block to the engine. And with the thread locking fluid, it shouldn't back out. And the same goes with the front one. It takes a 13mm nut. So you'll just thread that 13mm nut all the way on, and it just gives you a place to put a wrench on and tighten it down to the bike. So let's get started. So now that we have the threads coated with a little bit of blue Loctite and we hand tightened everything in, we want to then go back and make sure the silent blocks are securely fastened to the engine. And like I said, we're going to use an 8mm socket. And you're just going to want, you don't need to torque them, but you kind of feel it. Once it starts to turn, the rubber starts to turn, that's plenty. Then you can hold it and then back the bolt out. Same with the front, 13mm closed end wrench. This one's a ratcheting one, so it makes it a little bit easier. Come up on the front. Okay, same story. Back that nut off. Make sure the thing doesn't loosen, so you want to hold it just to be sure it doesn't loosen up. All right, now that we have the silent blocks installed on the bike, securely fastened to the engine, we're then going to be ready to install the engine protection bar. So the first bolt that we took out, this is going to be replaced with a 10x65mm bolt with a 7mm spacer. On this silent block, it's going to be a 10x15mm bolt with a 10mm washer. And on the front, it's going to be an 8mm self-locking nut. So let's get started. First I'm going to do is I'm going to hook the stud up on the front of the engine bar, wrap it around, and then put my top bolt in. Just make sure you put a little dab of locking fluid on it. Make sure nothing backs out. The first two bolts that we did, you want to make sure you put a drop of Loctite. And on the front nut, you're not going to need any Loctite because it's a self-locking nut. Okay. So now that we've got each bolt and nut just started, we want to then go back with a hand tool and just get everything nice and snug. And then once it's nice and snug, we'll go back with a torque wrench and make sure everything's torqued down to spec. Once again, with tightening that front bolt the same way it came out, we're going to want to use this extension and then the wobble socket just to make it easier to get it on nice and tight. Coming through the middle of the header, in between the radiator and the oil cooler. All right, now that we have all the bolts started, nice and snug with your hand tool, we then want to go back and make sure everything's torqued to spec. So this front nut is 12 Newton meters, this upper bolt is 60 Newton meters, and this bottom bolt is 15 Newton meters. If you don't have a torque wrench and you work on your own bike, we have a selection of very high quality German torque wrenches available on our site. So let's get started. Now that everything's tightened to spec, everything's installed properly, let's move to the right side. Okay, the right side is very similar to the left. The only difference is we're going to be removing one bolt with a T50. Then we're going to be installing two silent blocks, just like we did on the left side. The first one's going to be here, it's the 10mm. The other one is up around this radiator hose. It's going to be the 8mm silent block. We're going to use the same tip. It works really well. Install the nut or install the bolt into the silent block. Just gives you something to tighten down on. And once again, you always want to make sure you use a little bit of Loctite on each bolt that you put on your bike, just to ensure nothing comes out while you're riding. All right, now that we have the silent blocks just hand tight, you then want to take a hand tool, go back, and just make sure it's nice and snug. You'll be able to feel it. Once it starts to turn and the rubber starts to bend, you want to stop before anything happens. So this is going to be a 8mm Allen, and then the front one is going to be a 13mm closed end wrench, works good. Or what I've done, without taking out this lower body panel, you can actually fish a extended 13mm socket on a ratcheting wrench in between the oil cooler and the radiator, and there's enough room to get that in there just to make sure it's nice and snug and tight. So now that the silent blocks are nice and tight, we then want to remove the fastener that we use to tighten the silent block to the engine case, because they're going to be the same fasteners that fasten the engine bar to the bike. All right, now that we have the silent blocks Loctited and nice and snug to the engine, we're now ready to install the right engine protection bar. So just like the left, it's going to be attached with 3 fasteners. There's going to be a 10x90 at the top, and there's also going to be a special spacer that sandwiches in between the engine bar and the frame. There's going to be a 10x15mm bolt with a 10mm washer on the bottom. And just like the front, there's going to be an 8mm nut, a self-locking nut that doesn't need any locking fluid. Just a little tip on putting the bar on, just like the left side, what we could do is just come through and hook the bottom mount around the stud. Once that's there, get the spacer, get the bolt with the little Loctite. You can just put it in, hand tight, and now the bar's not going anywhere, and we can finish putting the rest of the fasteners in. All right, now that everything is nice and hand tight, we're then going to take our 8mm socket and just make sure everything is nice and snug, then come back and then torque it to spec. And on the front mount, you're going to want to use a 13mm closed end wrench, open end wrench, or a socket. What I found that works pretty good on the front bolt is getting, just like the left side, an extension with a U-joint socket adapter, just to get around the header and onto the nut to make sure it's nice and snug. All right, now everything's nice and hand snug. We're going to go back now and we're going to torque everything to spec. The top bolt is going to be 60 Newton meters. The bottom bolt is going to be 15 Newton meters, and the front nut is going to be 12 Newton meters. Let's get started. Now that everything's nice and secure, the engine bars have been installed, there's a couple things that I like to go over before we end this video. The kit comes with a abrasion-free tape, and what that's for is due to manufacturing tolerances. You may or may not see that the radiator hose may make a little contact with the engine bar, and just to prevent any damage, you can apply this to the radiator hose where it's making contact, just to prevent any kind of rubbing or damage to the radiator hose. This may not happen in all cases, but if you do find it necessary, we supply this tape for that purpose. And the next thing is, if you have larger hands than I, or you're just having if you're struggling getting the front nut on, you can easily remove this bottom piece, which I didn't have to do because I was able to get the fasteners on. But to remove this, there's a bolt here, there's a couple bolts at the bottom, but the most important is this rivet. And the way that rivet works is you'll find the rivet, and then there's a circular part of the rivet. You just want to push the center of the rivet where it comes out. It'll fall out, then the rivet will pop out of the plastic and the piece will come off, and then you'll have more room to get your hands up in there to securely tighten that front nut. So now that we have the engine bars installed, there is one additional part that you can purchase to install on the engine bars, giving you just a little bit of added protection. It's the Wunderlich impact pad, and what that's going to do, it's going to mount onto your engine bars, and the idea behind it is that it absorbs any kind of impact. This is going to touch the asphalt or pavement before your engine bars do, and it's going to absorb the impact as they go into the engine bar to your engine case, just to make sure your bike is well protected in case of any accident or tip over. Let me show you how easy it is to install. These are the parts that come supplied. Very simple. You got your 10mm bolt, throw on the washer, press it through the slider. This spacer goes in here, presses there. This aluminum spacer goes in there. Another aluminum spacer on top. And then once this is installed in the bar, then you have your fender washer and then your nylon locking nut. Let's put it on the bike. Okay, so we have it assembled. It goes on the bike. There's this middle hole here. It just slips in. You put the washer on the back side and then the nylon nut. Finger tight everything. If you like, you can line up the Wunderlich protection just to make it look nice. Once you have it in spot, you got a 7mm closed-end wrench. You got a T50 Torx. Simply put it on there. Again, you just want to probably hold it, tighten it up on the back. And just remember, it is a nylon nut, no Loctite needed. And there's really no torque spec. You just want to make sure it's nice and snug. And there you have it. So now that we have the slider installed onto the engine bars, they go hand in hand together. If you have the engine bars on your bike, or you're planning on buying engine protection bars for your S1000 XR, we highly recommend that you consider also equipping your bike with the impact slider, just to give your bike that added level of protection. So there you have it. This is the installation of the S1000 XR engine protection bars. If you'd like any additional information, please go to our website at www.wunderlichamerica.com.